Zix-Kalar floated in his meditation chamber when the call came through the bioneural network. The gentle blue light that surrounded his elongated form pulsed once, twice, then settled into a steady glow that meant official business. He opened his large black eyes and extended one of his forearms to touch the communication node growing from the wall. The message came directly into his mind as images and concepts rather than words. The Confederation Council needed him for a new assignment. A recently discovered species on the third planet of a yellow star system required observation and classification. The species called themselves humans, and early reports suggested they were engaged in constant warfare with each other. Zix-Kalar felt a ripple of excitement through his translucent skin. In his 300 years of life, he had observed 17 different species during their pre-spaceflight development stages. Most were peaceful plant-eaters or simple hunter-gatherers who occasionally fought over food sources or territory. The work was usually routine but important for determining which species might eventually join the galactic community. He responded to the communication node with his acceptance and began preparing for the journey. His ship, a living vessel grown from modified coral trees, needed only a few adjustments to its biodrives before it could make the jump to the human star system. The ship itself was invisible to most forms of detection, its skin able to bend light and energy around its hull like water flowing around a stone. The journey took 3 standard days through the bio-warp corridors that connected the peaceful worlds of the Confederation. During the trip, Zix-Kalar reviewed the limited data that advanced scouts had gathered about humanity. The humans were bipedal mammals with short lifespans of less than 100 years. They lived on a blue and green world rich in water and plant life. Most interesting was their apparent inability to stop fighting each other despite having abundant resources. When his ship emerged from bio-warp at the edge of the human solar system, Zix-Kalar was struck by the beauty of their world. The planet showed bright blues and greens with swirling white clouds. It reminded him of his own homeworld before his species had learned to live in harmony with nature. He positioned his ship in the shadow of one of the outer planets and activated the long-range sensors. The first thing that surprised him was the level of electromagnetic noise coming from the human world. His people communicated through bioneural networks and gentle bioluminescent displays. The humans seemed to fill their atmosphere with radio waves, television signals, and various forms of electronic chatter. They were loud in ways his species had never imagined possible. Zix-Kalar focused his sensors on the planet's surface and began cataloging what he saw. The humans had covered much of their world with geometric structures made from stone, metal, and other processed materials. They had carved straight lines across the landscape for transportation and created vast areas dedicated to growing food. The scale of their planetary modification was impressive for such a young species, but what drew his attention most were the areas where human military forces were gathering. Along several continental borders, he could see thousands of humans moving in organized formations. They carried weapons and operated vehicles designed for combat. This was clearly one of the territorial disputes mentioned in the advance reports. He settled his ship into a stable orbit and began detailed observations of a conflict zone in what the humans called Europe. 2 groups of humans faced each other across a river valley, each side preparing for battle. Zix-Kalar activated his biorecorders and began documenting what he expected would be a simple territorial dispute over water rights or grazing land. The human forces were led by commanders named Jake Morrison and Lisa Rodriguez. Morrison commanded the northern forces while Rodriguez led the southern army. Both were young by human standards, probably less than 40 years old, but they moved with confidence and authority that impressed Zix-Kalar. His own people rarely achieved such leadership positions before their 2nd century of life. As he watched, the human armies began their engagement. The first thing that struck Zix-Kalar was the coordination. Unlike the chaotic skirmishes he had observed in other species, the humans moved in precise formations. They communicated through electronic devices and hand signals, adjusting their tactics in real time as the battle developed. Jake Morrison's forces advanced across the valley using metal vehicles that moved on rotating treads. The vehicles fired explosive projectiles while human soldiers followed behind them on foot. Lisa Rodriguez's forces responded by retreating to prepared positions on higher ground, then launching their own projectiles from concealed locations. What puzzled Zix-Kalar was the complexity of the engagement. This was not a simple fight over resources. Both sides seemed to be testing each other, probing for weaknesses, adapting their strategies based on the opponent's responses. The humans were learning from each moment of the battle and changing their approach accordingly. The battle lasted for several hours, and during that time, Zix-Kalar observed behavior that confused him greatly. Human soldiers would risk their own lives to rescue wounded comrades, even when it provided no tactical advantage. They would fight harder when their leaders were threatened, not because of military necessity but apparently out of emotional attachment. Some humans continued fighting even when severely injured, driven by motivations that Zix-Kalar could not identify. When the engagement finally ended with Morrison's forces withdrawing across the river, both sides had suffered casualties, but neither had achieved a decisive victory. More puzzling still, both commanders seemed satisfied with the outcome. They had tested each other's capabilities and gathered information for future conflicts. Zix-Kalar spent the next several days reviewing his recordings and trying to understand what he had witnessed. The humans possessed technological capabilities, roughly equivalent to his species' early industrial period, but their approach to warfare was far more sophisticated than anything in the Confederation databases. They seemed to view combat not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a complex problem-solving exercise. He began preparing his first report to the Confederation Council, but found himself struggling to categorize what he had observed. The standard forms for reporting on pre-spaceflight species had categories for resource conflicts, territorial disputes, and population pressures. There was no category for species that seemed to fight simply to test their capabilities against each other. As he worked on his report, Zix-Kalar noticed something that made his skin pale with concern. The human electromagnetic chatter had increased significantly since the battle. Both sides were broadcasting detailed information about the engagement to other human groups around the planet. They were sharing tactical lessons, discussing improvements to their weapons and strategies, and analyzing their opponents' capabilities. The humans were not just fighting local territorial disputes. They were part of a planet-wide network of military knowledge sharing. Every engagement taught lessons that spread to human forces everywhere. They were collectively learning how to wage war more effectively with each passing day. Zix-Kalar realized that his simple observation mission might be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. 3 weeks into his observation mission, Zix-Kalar had settled into what he thought was a routine pattern of documenting human conflicts. Each day brought new skirmishes between different human groups, and he carefully recorded their weapons, tactics, and casualty rates. The data would help the Confederation Council understand whether humans posed any threat to galactic peace. The morning that everything changed began like any other. Zix-Kalar was monitoring radio communications from the human naval forces when he detected a major engagement developing in one of their ocean regions. 2 large fleets of human warships were converging on each other, commanded by Admiral Pete Collins and Captain Maria Santos. The scale was larger than anything he had observed so far. Zix-Kalar adjusted his sensors to focus on the ocean battle. The human warships were massive metal structures that floated on the water surface, each one carrying hundreds of crew members and bristling with weapons. The ships moved in precise formations, communicating through radio signals that his biocomputers automatically translated. Admiral Collins commanded a fleet of 12 warships from his flagship. His voice came through the radio channels calm and professional as he directed his forces into battle formation. Captain Santos led 9 ships in response, her fleet moving to intercept Collins at a strategic choke point between 2 island chains. What struck Zix-Kalar immediately was the professionalism of both commanders. They spoke to their crews with the same tone his own people used for routine scientific experiments. There was no anger, no emotional outbursts, just careful calculation and precise execution of complex maneuvers. These humans were treating warfare like a technical discipline. The engagement began when Santos ordered her ships to fire their main weapons at extreme range. Massive projectiles weighing several hundred pounds flew through the air and struck Collins' formation, causing explosions that could be seen from orbit. Collins responded by ordering his ships to close distance while returning fire with their own guns. For the next 4 hours, Zixkalar watched the two fleets maneuver and fight, with skills that impressed and disturbed him. The human crews operated their weapons with machine-like precision, while their ships performed complex tactical movements. Damaged vessels continued fighting even when clearly outmatched, their crews refusing to surrender despite facing certain destruction. But what truly unsettled Zixkalar was not the violence itself. His observations of other species had included territorial conflicts and resource wars. What disturbed him was the motivation behind the human fighting. As he listened to the radio communications, he realized this battle was not about territory, resources, or survival. The humans were fighting over something they called national honor. Through intercepted communications, Zixkalar learned that Collins and Santos represented different human nations that had been allies until recently. A diplomatic incident involving trade agreements had escalated into accusations of betrayal and broken promises. Neither side needed the other's resources. Neither side was fighting for territory that would benefit their populations. They were fighting because one group felt insulted by the other. This concept was completely foreign to Zixkalar's species. The Confederation had studied thousands of species throughout the galaxy, and conflicts were always about concrete needs: food, water, living space mates, or protection from environmental threats. The idea of fighting and dying over abstract concepts like honor or pride was beyond his understanding. The battle reached its climax when Santos's flagship took critical damage from Collins's concentrated fire. The ship was listing heavily, and fires burned across its superstructure. Any rational species would surrender at this point to preserve the lives of the crew. Instead, Santos ordered her remaining ships to close distance for a final attack, sacrificing themselves to damage Collins' fleet. As Zixkalar watched in growing horror, Santos's crippled flagship rammed directly into Collins' command vessel. The explosion destroyed both ships and killed over 1,000 humans in seconds. The surviving vessels from both fleets continued fighting until only 3 ships remained afloat, all of them too damaged to continue the engagement. In the aftermath, as rescue ships from both sides worked to save survivors, Zixkalar listened to the radio communications between the scattered crew members. He expected to hear regret, questioning of their leader's decisions, or anger at the senseless loss of life. Instead, he heard something that chilled him to his core. The survivors spoke with pride about their commander's courage. Collins's crew praised his tactical brilliance and willingness to close with the enemy. Santos's crew honored her sacrifice and spoke of her ramming attack as the most glorious moment in their naval history. Both sides treated the devastating battle as a source of inspiration rather than tragedy. Zixkalar spent the next several days reviewing his recordings and trying to process what he had witnessed. The humans had lost over 2,000 lives and destroyed millions of units worth of military equipment in a battle that accomplished nothing concrete. No territory changed hands. No resources were captured. No strategic advantages were gained. Yet both sides considered the engagement a success because they had demonstrated their willingness to fight and die for intangible principles. This realization led Zixkalar to examine his previous observations more carefully. The border skirmish between Morrison and Rodriguez had not been about the river valley at all. It had been about testing each other's resolve and tactical capabilities. The humans were not fighting for practical reasons. They were fighting to prove something about themselves to each other and to their own populations. Over the following days, Zixkalar began noticing patterns in human behavior that disturbed him deeply. In a mountain region, he observed a small unit led by Commander Alan Rivers holding a defensive position against overwhelming odds. The position had no strategic value and could have been bypassed easily. Rivers' forces were surrounded and facing certain destruction. Any rational species would retreat to preserve their lives and equipment for more important battles. Instead, Rivers ordered his troops to hold their ground because retreating would mean abandoning wounded soldiers who could not be moved. For 3 days, Rivers' unit fought against forces 10 times their size, suffering 90% casualties before the survivors were finally overrun. The most disturbing part was not the tactical foolishness of the decision. It was the fact that River's sacrifice became a rallying cry for other human forces in the region. Within days, recruitment for the human military increased dramatically as young humans volunteered to serve, inspired by River's example of loyalty to his comrades. Six-Kalar realized he was observing something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans had turned self-sacrifice into a form of psychological warfare. They used their own willingness to die as a weapon against their enemies and as inspiration for their own people. They had weaponized the concept of martyrdom. The implications were staggering. Every species the Confederation had encountered valued individual survival and group preservation above all else. Conflicts ended when the cost became too high or the benefits too small. But humans seemed capable of escalating conflicts beyond any rational cost-benefit analysis, driven by abstract concepts that meant more to them than their own lives. Six-Kalar began his second report to the Confederation Council with hands that trembled slightly as he operated his biocomputer interface. He tried to explain what he had observed, but the standard reporting categories seemed inadequate. How could he convey to a peaceful galactic community that humans fought not just with weapons and tactics, but with ideas that made them willing to die for causes beyond survival? As he worked on the report, Six-Kalar became aware of Katie Bell, a human explosive disposal specialist working in one of the recent battle zones. Bell's unit was clearing dangerous devices left behind by retreating forces when they encountered a particularly large explosive. The device was too unstable to disarm safely, but it blocked the only route forward for advancing human forces. Bell made a decision that exemplified everything that terrified Six-Kalar about human nature. She ordered her team to retreat to safety, then deliberately triggered the explosive while lying on top of it. Her body absorbed most of the blast, allowing her comrades to advance while she died instantly. The other humans did not treat Bell's death as a tragic waste of life. They treated it as heroic inspiration. Within hours, her name was being broadcast across human communication networks as an example of courage and dedication. Her sacrifice motivated thousands of other humans to volunteer for dangerous assignments, seeing her death not as something to be avoided but as an ideal to emulate. Six-Kalar finally understood the true horror of what he was observing. The humans were not just willing to die for abstract principles. They had created a culture that celebrated such deaths and used them to inspire others to similar sacrifices. They had turned their own mortality into a weapon more powerful than any technology he had observed. His second report to the Confederation Council was marked with the highest priority warnings he was authorized to use. 2 months into his observation mission, Six-Kalar thought he understood the scope of human warfare. He had documented their small unit tactics, naval engagements, and individual acts of sacrifice. His reports to the Confederation Council had described humans as a species with unusual motivations for conflict, but limited technological capabilities. That assessment changed completely when the global situation began to escalate. The first sign of what was coming appeared in the human communication networks. Six-Kalar noticed increased military chatter between different continental regions, with human leaders coordinating movements of forces on a scale he had not previously observed. President Caroline Fisher was issuing orders that affected millions of humans across multiple nations, while General Nathan Cross was coordinating with military commanders on different continents. Six-Kalar adjusted his sensors to monitor the entire planet and was shocked by what he discovered. The humans were not just engaged in local territorial disputes. They were preparing for warfare on a planetary scale that involved every major population center on their world. The scope was beyond anything in Confederation records for pre-space flight, a species. Within days, the human military mobilization reached levels that made Six-Kalar question his instruments. Millions of humans were being organized into military units and transported to staging areas around the globe. Factories that had been producing civilian goods were rapidly converted to manufacture weapons, vehicles, and military equipment. The humans were transforming their entire planetary economy into a war machine. The scale of coordination required for such mobilization impressed and terrified Six-Kalar. His own species had never organized more than a few thousand individuals for any single purpose. The largest conflicts in Confederation history had involved perhaps 10,000 combatants fighting over mining rights or water access. But the humans were organizing tens of millions of soldiers for conflicts that spanned continents. The first major engagement of this escalated warfare occurred in a vast plain region, where Colonel Ray Palmer led an armored division against forces, commanded by Major Susan Wright. Zix-Kalar watched from orbit as thousands of human combat vehicles maneuvered across hundreds of square kilometers of terrain. The battle involved more military equipment than existed in the entire Confederation fleet. Palmer's forces consisted of over 500 tracked vehicles armed with large-caliber guns, supported by hundreds of wheeled vehicles carrying supplies and communications equipment. Wright commanded a similar force positioned on elevated terrain overlooking the plain. Both armies were supported by aircraft that provided reconnaissance and close air support. When the engagement began, Zix-Kalar was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of destruction. Thousands of explosive rounds filled the air while aircraft dropped bombs and fired rockets at ground targets. The noise was so intense that it registered on his orbital sensors as seismic activity. Smoke and dust clouds covered the entire battle area, forcing both sides to fight using electronic sensors rather than visual observation. What shocked Zix-Kalar most was not the scale of the destruction, but the speed of human adaptation. During the battle, both Palmer and Wright modified their tactics multiple times in response to changing conditions. They repositioned their forces, changed their attack routes, and developed new techniques for coordinating their units. The humans were innovating in real time while under fire. By the end of the first day, Palmer's forces had lost over 200 vehicles, while Wright's forces had lost nearly 300. In any Confederation conflict, such casualties would have ended the engagement immediately. Instead, both human commanders brought forward reserve units and continued fighting. The battle lasted for 5 days and involved over 10,000 vehicles before Wright's forces finally withdrew. But the most disturbing aspect of the engagement was what happened afterward. Within hours of the battle's end, both sides were broadcasting detailed analyses of the engagement to their respective military commands. They shared information about successful tactics, equipment failures, and lessons learned. Every mistake and innovation was documented and transmitted to other human military units around the planet. Zix-Kalar realized that the humans were using each battle as a learning laboratory. Every engagement provided data that improved their overall military effectiveness. They were not just fighting individual wars, but participating in a species-wide evolution of warfare techniques. Each conflict made all human forces more capable and dangerous. This pattern repeated across the planet as the global conflict intensified. In the air, pilot Alex Turner engaged in aerial combat using aircraft that moved faster than anything Zix-Kalar had seen from a pre-spaceflight species. Turner's engagements with enemy pilots involved complex three-dimensional maneuvers and split-second decision-making that pushed both human reflexes and machine capabilities to their limits. On the ground, engineer Lucy Davis was developing new defensive systems in response to evolving human offensive capabilities. Davis worked with teams of other humans to design and build fortifications, weapons, and communication systems that were more advanced than what had existed just months earlier. The pace of human technological advancement was accelerating under the pressure of warfare. Zix-Kalar began to understand something that terrified him about human nature. Other species developed technology gradually over thousands of years, driven by curiosity and the need to solve environmental challenges. Humans seemed capable of advancing their technology at exponential rates when motivated by the need to kill each other more effectively. The human capacity for rapid innovation became even more apparent when Zix-Kalar observed their manufacturing capabilities. Factories that had been producing civilian vehicles were retooled to build tanks in a matter of weeks. Facilities that manufactured electronic devices were converted to produce military communication equipment. The humans could reshape their entire industrial infrastructure faster than Zix-Kalar had thought possible. More disturbing was the fact that human civilians supported this transformation willingly. Factory workers volunteered for extended shifts to increase production. Scientists abandoned peaceful research projects to develop military technology. Even human children were organized to collect materials for the war effort. The entire species seemed to embrace warfare as their primary focus. Zix-Kalar watched civilian populations in cities far from any fighting organize themselves to support the military effort. They rationed food and resources, volunteered for dangerous manufacturing, work, and accepted massive disruptions to their normal lives. The humans were demonstrating a level of social coordination that his peaceful species had never achieved even during natural disasters. The global conflict continued to escalate as more human nations became involved. Naval battles raged across the planet's oceans while armies numbering in the millions clashed on multiple continents. Aircraft filled the skies in numbers that blocked out sunlight over battle areas. The humans were fighting the largest war in their recorded history, and they seemed to be enjoying the challenge. What made Zix-Kalar's skin turn pale with fear was the realization that this massive global conflict was teaching humans to cooperate on an unprecedented scale. Nations that had been enemies for centuries were forming alliances and sharing military technology. Human commanders were learning to coordinate operations across vast distances using their primitive communication systems. The war was not destroying human civilization as Zix-Kalar had expected. Instead, it was forcing them to develop new forms of organization and cooperation that made them more capable as a species. They were using warfare as a tool for rapid social and technological evolution. His third report to the Confederation Council carried the highest possible threat assessment warnings. Zix-Kalar tried to convey that the humans were not simply a warlike species that might eventually burn themselves out through constant fighting. They were a species that used warfare as a method for accelerated development, becoming more dangerous and capable with each conflict. But even as he prepared his report, Zix-Kalar noticed new developments that suggested the situation was about to become far worse. Human scientists and engineers were working on projects that went beyond conventional weapons and tactics. Deep underground facilities were being constructed with massive power requirements and unprecedented security measures. The humans were developing something new, and Zix-Kalar suspected that whatever they were creating would make their conventional warfare look primitive by comparison. As he transmitted his report to the Confederation Council, he realized that his observation mission was no longer about cataloging a pre-spaceflight species. He was documenting the emergence of something that might pose a threat to the entire galaxy. The global war continued to rage below him, with human forces growing stronger and more coordinated each day. Zix-Kalar found himself wondering if the Confederation Council would believe his reports, and whether they would act on his warnings before it was too late to contain the human threat. 4 months into his observation mission, Zix-Kalar had witnessed human warfare evolve from simple territorial disputes to global conflicts involving millions of combatants. He thought he understood the extent of human destructive capability until his sensors detected something that made his primary heart stop beating. Deep beneath the surface of the human world, in heavily guarded underground facilities, scientists were working on projects that defied everything he thought he knew about pre-spaceflight species. The first indication came when Zix-Kalar detected unusual energy signatures emanating from a remote human installation in a desert region. The facility was surrounded by multiple layers of security and operated by a team led by Dr. Helen Murphy and Dr. Carl Jackson. The electromagnetic readings were unlike anything in the Confederation databases, suggesting the humans were manipulating forces that his own species had not discovered until they achieved interstellar travel. Zix-Kalar focused his most sensitive sensors on the facility and began intercepting human communications. What he discovered in those intercepted transmissions sent waves of terror through his elongated form. The humans had learned to split the atom. They were harnessing the fundamental forces that held matter together and turning them into weapons of unimaginable destruction. The concept was so alien to Zix-Kalar's understanding that he initially thought his translation programs were malfunctioning. His species had achieved spaceflight through biotechnology that worked in harmony with natural forces. They grew their ships from living coral, powered them with bioelectric processes, and navigated using biological sensors that detected gravitational currents. The idea of forcing atomic nuclei apart to release energy was like using explosives to perform surgery. As he continued monitoring human communications, Zix-Kalar realized the full scope of what the humans had accomplished. Dr. Murphy's team had not only split the atom but had learned to control the chain reaction that resulted. They could release this atomic energy slowly to generate power for their cities, or rapidly to create explosions more powerful than anything achieved with conventional weapons. The mathematical calculations that Zix-Kalar intercepted from Dr. Jackson's research team were beyond his comprehension. The humans were discussing energy releases measured in units that represented the explosive power of thousands of tons of conventional explosives. A single human atomic weapon could destroy an entire city and kill hundreds of thousands of people in seconds. But what truly horrified Zix-Kalar was not just the destructive potential of these weapons. It was the realization that human civilization had developed along a completely different path than any species in Confederation history. While peaceful species learned to work with natural forces and biological systems, humans had built their entire technological foundation on the controlled use of destructive processes. Human transportation systems were powered by controlled explosions of chemical fuel. Their industrial processes used violent chemical reactions to transform raw materials. Their power generation relied on burning fossil fuels or forcing steam through turbines. Every aspect of human technology was based on harnessing and controlling destructive forces. Atomic weapons were not an aberration in human development. They were the logical next step for a species that had always used destruction as a tool for creation. The humans had looked at the forces that held the universe together and decided to break them apart for their own purposes. Zix-Kalar spent days reviewing his recordings and trying to understand how a species could maintain psychological stability while possessing such devastating weapons. The atomic devices that Dr. Murphy's team had created could destroy entire regions of their planet. If used extensively, they could render their world uninhabitable for thousands of years. Yet the humans continued their normal activities, as if living under this constant threat was perfectly natural. Through intercepted communications, Zix-Kalar learned that multiple human nations were developing atomic weapons simultaneously. General Victoria Stone was coordinating the military deployment of these devices, while Admiral Chris Kennedy was developing delivery systems that could transport atomic weapons across continental distances. The humans were not content to possess a few experimental weapons. They were building arsenals capable of destroying their entire civilization multiple times over. The psychological implications were staggering. Zix-Kalar's species had developed peaceful technologies that enhanced life and promoted harmony with natural systems. When they encountered problems, they sought solutions through cooperation and biological adaptation. The humans faced the ultimate problem of potentially destroying themselves, and their solution was to build more weapons and develop better delivery systems. What made the situation even more terrifying was the human capacity for rational decision-making, despite the existential threat they had created. Military leaders like Sergeant Tony Garcia and Lieutenant Amy Foster continued their duties with the same professionalism they had shown during conventional warfare. They treated atomic weapons as tools to be managed and deployed according to strategic requirements. Zix-Kalar realized that humans possessed a psychological trait that had never been documented in Confederation records. They could live with the constant possibility of their own extinction while maintaining normal social and military functions. They had achieved a level of emotional compartmentalization that allowed them to function effectively under conditions that would paralyze any other known species. The development of atomic weapons also revealed another disturbing aspect of human nature. Rather than slowing down their warfare to account for the increased destructive potential, the humans seemed to be accelerating their military activities. Conventional conflicts continued around the globe while atomic weapons development proceeded in parallel. The humans were simultaneously preparing for traditional warfare and ultimate destruction. Through continued monitoring, Zix-Kalar discovered that human military planners were developing strategies for fighting wars with atomic weapons. They calculated acceptable casualty levels, identified priority targets, and established command structures that could survive atomic attacks. Humans were not just building weapons of mass destruction, they were learning how to use them effectively. The strategic thinking involved in atomic warfare planning was more sophisticated than anything Zixkalar had observed during his previous species studies. Human planners like General Stone considered multiple variables including wind patterns, population densities, industrial targets, and enemy response capabilities. They were treating atomic warfare as a complex technical problem that required careful analysis and precise execution. Even more disturbing was the human development of countermeasures against their own atomic weapons. Teams of scientists and engineers were working on detection systems, defensive measures, and survival protocols for atomic warfare. The humans were simultaneously creating the ultimate threat and developing methods to survive it. Zixkalar began to understand that atomic weapons represented more than just advanced military technology for humans. They were a fundamental expression of human nature. The humans had looked at the most basic forces of the universe and decided to weaponize them. They had turned the building blocks of matter into tools for destroying matter. The implications for the galaxy were terrifying. If humans ever achieved spaceflight, they would bring their atomic weapons with them. They would enter the galactic community as a species that had already mastered the art of planetary destruction. No peaceful species in Confederation history had ever developed such capabilities or demonstrated such willingness to use them. As Zixkalar prepared his fourth report to the Confederation Council, he struggled to find words that could convey the magnitude of the threat he had discovered. The standard reporting categories had no provisions for species that could destroy their own worlds. There were no protocols for dealing with civilizations that used atomic energy as a weapon, rather than a tool for peaceful development. His report carried every possible warning designation, but Zixkalar feared that even the most alarming language would fail to communicate the reality of what he had observed. The humans had not just developed powerful weapons. They had created the means to destroy entire worlds, and they showed every indication of being willing to use them. The war continued to rage on the planet below, while atomic weapons development proceeded in secret facilities around the globe. Zixkalar realized that he was no longer observing a pre-spaceflight species engaged in primitive warfare. He was documenting the emergence of a civilization that had weaponized the fundamental forces of nature and showed no fear of using them. 6 months into his observation mission, Zixkalar had documented horrors beyond anything in Confederation history. Human atomic weapons represented the ultimate expression of their destructive nature, but what he discovered next made him realize that their ambitions extended far beyond their own planet. The humans were not content to threaten only themselves. They were planning to weaponize space itself. The discovery came through intercepted communications from a facility that Dr. Benjamin Clark called the Orbital Defense Initiative. Initially, Zixkalar assumed this was a defensive project designed to protect Earth from potential asteroid impacts. His species had developed similar systems using bioengineered organisms that could redirect dangerous space objects. But as he monitored more transmissions, he realized the humans had something far more sinister in mind. Colonel Sandra Lee was coordinating the development of orbital weapons platforms that could attack targets on the planet's surface from space. The project involved launching massive metal structures into orbit around Earth, each one equipped with kinetic bombardment systems that could drop tungsten rods onto surface targets with the force of atomic weapons, but without radioactive contamination. The concept was terrifyingly elegant in its simplicity. By positioning weapons in space, the humans could attack any target on their planet within minutes, bypassing all conventional defenses. The kinetic energy of objects dropped from orbital altitude would create explosions comparable to their atomic weapons. But the space-based platforms would be nearly impossible to destroy using surface-based weapons. Zixkalar realized that humans were not just developing better ways to fight each other. They were creating weapon systems that could be used against any species that might threaten them from space. The orbital platforms represented humanity's first steps toward militarizing their local space environment, and the implications for galactic security were staggering. But the Orbital Weapons Project revealed something even more disturbing about human capabilities. The level of precision required to drop objects from orbit onto specific surface targets was extraordinarily difficult. Yet the humans were achieving this precision using primitive rocket technology and basic computer systems. Their ability to overcome technical challenges through determination and innovation was beyond anything Zix-Kalar had observed in other species. The project also demonstrated human strategic thinking on a scale that terrified him. The orbital weapons were not designed for immediate use in their current global war. They were being built for future conflicts against enemies that might not even exist yet. The humans were planning military capabilities decades in advance, anticipating threats that they had never encountered. Through continued monitoring, Zix-Kalar learned that the orbital weapons project was only one part of a larger human space militarization effort. Teams of engineers were developing space-based sensors, communication systems, and even plans for armed spacecraft. The humans were treating space as another battlefield to be conquered and controlled. What made this development particularly alarming was the speed of human progress. In just 6 months of observation, Zix-Kalar had watched them advance from conventional warfare to atomic weapons to space-based military systems. The pace of their technological advancement was accelerating exponentially, driven by their competitive nature and willingness to take enormous risks. The final straw came when Zix-Kalar realized that his own observation mission had been detected. Captain Danny Rivera, leading a newly formed space surveillance division, had been tracking unusual electromagnetic signatures in Earth's orbital space. The humans had developed counter-surveillance technology while fighting their global war, demonstrating an ability to multitask that no other species had ever achieved. Rivera's team had identified the general location of Zix-Kalar's cloaked ship and were developing methods to track and potentially intercept it. The humans had discovered that they were being observed and were treating the unknown observer as a potential threat. Their response was not to try communicating or to increase their own defensive measures. Their response was to develop weapons that could reach into space and destroy the observer. Zix-Kalar watched in growing panic as Rivera's division launched a series of test missiles designed to intercept objects in high orbit. The missiles were primitive by Confederation standards, but they were effective enough to threaten his ship if the humans managed to locate it precisely. More terrifying was the realization that these anti-spacecraft weapons had been developed in just weeks as soon as the humans suspected they were being watched. The implications were clear. Humanity was not just a warlike species that fought among themselves. They were a species that viewed any unknown presence as a potential enemy to be eliminated. They had detected evidence of advanced technology watching them from space, and their immediate response was to develop weapons capable of attacking that technology. Zix-Kalar began emergency preparations to leave the human solar system. His ship's biodrives required several hours to safely transition from orbital surveillance mode to interstellar travel configuration. During those hours, he continued monitoring human communications and discovered developments that filled him with existential dread. The humans were not limiting their space militarization efforts to their own orbital space. Projects led by leaders like Officer Kate Anderson and Private Joe Murphy were developing propulsion systems designed to reach other planets in their solar system. The humans were planning to expand their military presence throughout their local space environment, treating the entire solar system as territory to be claimed and defended. Even more alarming were intercepted discussions about interstellar travel. Human scientists were already theorizing about methods to travel between star systems, and their approaches involved the same aggressive manipulation of natural forces that characterized all their technology. They spoke of using atomic energy to power spacecraft and of reaching other stars to claim new worlds for human settlement. The prospect of humans achieving interstellar travel was the most terrifying possibility Zix-Kalar could imagine. A species that had weaponized atomic energy, militarized space, and treated all unknown contacts as enemies would be an existential threat to galactic civilization. The peaceful worlds of the Confederation would be defenseless against human military capabilities and tactical thinking. As his ship finally achieved readiness for departure, Zix-Kalar transmitted his final report to the Confederation Council. The message carried emergency priority codes that would ensure immediate attention from the highest levels of galactic government. He tried to convey the urgency of the situation, while knowing that his peaceful readers might not fully comprehend the threat he was describing. His report recommended immediate and permanent quarantine of the human solar system. No Confederation vessel should approach within 50 light-years of Earth until humanity either destroyed itself or evolved beyond their current aggressive nature. The risk of inadvertent contact was too great, and the potential consequences for galactic civilization were beyond calculation. But even as he transmitted his warnings, Zix-Kalar knew they might already be too late. The humans were advancing so rapidly that they might achieve interstellar travel within decades, rather than centuries. By the time the Confederation Council could organize an effective response, human spacecraft might already be exploring nearby star systems. His ship entered biowarp and began the journey back to Confederation space. But Zix-Kalar could not escape the images that haunted his memory. Human soldiers fighting with weapons that could destroy cities. Human scientists splitting atoms to power their civilization. Human engineers building weapons in space to threaten any potential enemies. The worst part was the realization that humans were not evil or malicious in their destructiveness. They were simply following their nature as a species that had evolved to compete, fight, and survive under any circumstances. Their violence was not pathological but practical, not emotional but strategic. They had turned warfare into a science, and destruction into an art form. Zix-Kalar settled into his ship's hibernation chamber for the long journey home, but sleep did not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw human faces. Commanders like Anderson and Murphy who had dedicated their lives to perfecting the art of warfare. Scientists like Clark and Lee who had weaponized the forces of nature. Soldiers who fought and died for abstract concepts that meant more to them than survival itself. Somewhere behind him in the darkness between stars, humanity continued to grow stronger, more dangerous, and more capable. They were learning to fight more effectively, building more powerful weapons and expanding their reach into space. The galaxy was not ready for what humans would become when they finally reached the stars. Zix-Kalar's final log entry, recorded as his ship approached Confederation space, contained a simple statement that would haunt galactic civilization for generations to come. They don't fight because they must. They fight because they can. And they're getting better at it every day.